William Aberhart was Premier of Alberta for many years, and he was also called Bible Bill. He ran the Calgary Prophetic Bible Institute, which was very close to the Moody Bible Institute, and the Back to the Bible Hour. And the huge charts of William Aberhart were put up, and they looked, in many ways, examined how the history of God worked, the ongoing commitment of God to the Jews, the return of the Jews to the land, and hence why, in time, Christians had to again and again support the Jews without asking critical questions. Bible Bill Aberhart, who had a huge following, in fact, his Back to the Bible broadcast reached across Canada, and many people growing up in many conservative evangelical homes took in that as almost church, the Aberhart Back to the Bible. The person who followed Aberhart in Alberta as Premier was, you guessed it, Ernest Manning, Preston Manning's father. Bible Bill died in 1943, and Ernest Manning ran the National Bible Hour from 1943 to 1989. Ernest Manning was so favored by the Jews and his interpretation of the Bible as the Jews as God-chosen people, the return to the land, and end times, that in fact B'nai B'rith in 1982 gave him their humanitarian award. Ernest Manning, Aberhart, Preston Manning, they all come out of conservative evangelical backgrounds. I had a long conversation a few months ago with Preston Manning. I was very interested in the Albertan tradition of Zionism, and given the fact he grew up in that tradition, the tree of his life grew out of that soil, I asked him, how did you make sense of the Aberhart, your dad's tradition, in terms of you making sense of your own faith in Israel? He said, I grew up in a context where prophecy was everything, in that conservative evangelical. And prophecy was about attempting to make sense. What is the relationship of the Bible to today's events? And who is the Antichrist and who isn't, and stuff like that. And he said, I came to see that that was really a cul-de-sac and a dead end. And so I have avoided that understanding of the prophetic in my own political career, just because it's so contentious, so uncertain, and it only leads people on rabbit trails. He says, I want to stick to a much more grounded political approach. And whether a person agrees with Ernest Manning's political position is not the point, but he has broken from his father and in some of those issues, and he would certainly be somewhat different and more moderate than Stephen Harper on the question of Israel. So in the Albertan tradition, three key figures, the premiers, really the heads of their provinces. These people are so immersed in dispensational end times theology, support of the Jews, return of the Jews to Israel, end times theology, that their politics is affected. Their politics is affected. These are people in politics. They're not theologians or exegetes in seminaries or Bible schools and churches. These are public figures who make public decisions not only at provincial level, but finally many of them move on to federal levels in their thinking, as Stephen Harper did. One of probably the biggest communication organizations in Canada that has a history of Christian Zionism is 100 Huntley Street. David Maintz often in the 1980s, when Jerry Falwell was alive, would bring him on the program, and they would both confer about what is the relationship of Christians in a Pentecostal alliance, a conservative evangelical tradition, to the state of Israel. 100 Huntley Street broadcasts across Canada. It has a large following, and its agenda has historically been Christian Zionist. We talk about Hal Lindsey. Probably the Hal Lindsey of Canada is Grant Jeffrey. Some may have heard of his brother David Jeffrey, a very well-known evangelical academic. Certainly has moved away from his upbringing, but Grant never did. Grant Jeffrey has written 30 books that deal with prophecy, end times, Israel. His organization, Frontier Research Publication. The 30 books have sold over 7 million copies in 24 languages. He died in the year 2012. Like 100 Huntley Street, a large, large following. Canadian Christian College in Toronto is very interesting. Charles McVitie at Canadian Christian College often invites John Hagee up. And the relationship between McVitie and Hagee is very, very close. In one sense, Canadian Christian College is the venue in Canada for Christians United for Israel and John Hagee's books and selling and appearances. Also at Canadian Christian College, Frank Dumont, the head of B'nai B'rith, teaches. Canadian Christian College have given Frank Dumont honorary doctorate. So here you can see Christians, B'nai B'rith, Israel, Christianity. So in Ontario, Grant Jeffrey, Frontier Research Institute, 100 Huntley Street, Canadian Christian College, Ezra Levant is a part of that connection, and many, many others. So to understand that what we call right-of-center Christianity in regards to faith, Zionism, Israel, these networks are very intertwined, and the more you dig under the soil and begin to connect the roots, they cross Canada, they go into the States. It's a very well-developed network. Speaking engagements, books, communications, politics, petitioning when elections come along, who you're going to support, very important to understand. Probably the leading academic historian in Canada, taught at Carleton for many years, is a fellow named Merkley from Carleton. He's written a couple of very important works in terms of the history of Christianity and Israel, the history of Christian-Jewish relations, and the politics of Christian Zionism. It was his work, as he began writing on it in the 90s, and the Alliance Reform parties were emerging in power, that it was Merkley's work that began to inform people like Stockwell Day and give them academic credentials. And the relationship between Merkley and Day is very close, and as most of you know, Stockwell Day is probably one of the most pro-Zionist MPs that we have in Canada. There's John Tweedy in this area. And so I could go further in terms of Ontario Christian Zionism, and there's many, many. And again, cross Canada, if you ever hope to understand what's going on in Canada, the relationship of Canada and the United States and the Zionist agenda, some of these people, these organizations, these publications, these communication networks, they're very integrated, and it's a very closely linked network. They're not just isolated from politics. In fact, they see themselves as playing a very prominent role in furthering a Zionist agenda through the Conservative Party in Canada. Many of the MPs, if I went through them bit by bit, who are in the Conservative Party, have grown up in conservative evangelical backgrounds, with that very strong commitment to the Jewish people and defending the Jewish people. And of course you want to say who wouldn't, given what the Jewish people have suffered in diaspora, but to support them to the exclusion of the Palestinians and to others raises obviously the serious problems we face today. 2006, when Hamas was elected, aid was cut by the Conservative Party. 2006, in the war with Lebanon, the Harper government took a very pro-Israeli position. 2009, 2014, when Israel confronted Gaza, again a strong pro-Israeli. Now, in a certain sense, you want to say, of course you should be sensitive to what's going on in Israel, but not to the exclusion of the complex nature of the Palestinian story also. It's not as simple as this or that. You don't want to reduce these things to comic book categories or simplistic formulas. The G8 summit in France a few years ago, Obama suggested, in fact, Israel return to the 1967 borders. Harper opposed that very strenuously. When Jason Kennedy was former Minister of Citizenship, Immigration, Multiculturalism, and George Galloway, an MP from Britain, wanted to come here, who was broadly sympathetic in a critical way to the Palestinians, Kennedy tried to prevent that from occurring. James Lunny and Stockwell Day in 2009 formed the Israel Allies Caucus, which is a front for the Knesset's agenda in Canada. John Baird, Foreign Affairs, in 2012, when the UN voted to at least give Palestine as non-member observer status, and it was voted 138 to 9 at the UN. It was Canada and the US which opposed that observer status position, and Baird suggested that if the UN went forward with it, Canada may make some more serious criticisms of the UN and act in some ways to oppose them. The funding to Kairos was cut, which was an ecumenical organization working in Palestine. Maida Al-Karmel, who worked with Palestinian women, aid to her was cut. And I can go on with different stories in terms of the conservative government, both at the level of CEDA, Canadian National Development Agency, Canadian positions in foreign policy that have obviously leaned very strongly in one direction. There's a whole history in Canada of acting in a moderate way, of saying, listen, of course the rights and needs of the Jews are legitimate. Look at their history. Look at what they have been through. Not to be sensitive to that is to have a heart of stone. That's a given. But there is also the needs and the desires, the history of the Palestinian people. So how do you bring these two together? And honor and respect both sides, not slip into polarization. And the danger of Christian Zionism, it leans very, very much on one side, and it tends to turn the back on the other side. And anyone who's interested in just peacemaking must recognize there's a huge space for peacemaking between Hamas at one extreme end and Netanyahu at another extreme end. The Christian Zionists tend to fairly uncritically support one position. Well, of course, there's many Jews, Palestinians, and Christians who are trying to find peace somewhere between those extremes. And that's really the role of people who are trying to be just peacemakers.